This little car here is the Kia Picanto, and not only is it one of the smallest new cars you can buy in Australia, it's also one of the most affordable. But despite that, the Picanto and cars like it are becoming increasingly rare on our roads, because as we all know, what might work around the streets of Seoul or Tokyo doesn't necessarily translate well to our great expanses in Australia. But if you are sticking to a metro capital, isn't the Picanto all the car you really need? Before we find out, remember, there'll be a full written review over on carsguide.com.au where we show our working as to how we got to the score at the end of this video. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit like, subscribe, and the bell notification icon to stay up to date with all of our latest content. The Picanto we have for this video is the edgy looking GT Line Auto, but we've also tested the absolute base S manual for this range review. Prices range from the mid 14,000s for that base car and go all the way up to almost 20,000 for the niche top-spec GT manual. While Japanese rivals offer plenty of K-class city cars overseas, they rarely bother bringing them down under, leaving the Picanto at this size and price in competition with only the MG3, Suzuki Ignis, and the about to be discontinued Mitsubishi Mirage. So what's new about the Picanto for this year's update? There's a new face with projector headlights, new fog lights, a new set of alloy wheels, and a slightly redesigned rear bumper. And well, that's about it really, but inside there's some more impressive stuff, so let's go check that out. Now, styling-wise, not a whole lot has changed in here. There's the same attractive, if slightly plasticky dash, but here in the GT line grade, you get a leather steering wheel, some padding for your elbows here, and a top box console. Now, what has changed, and in a big way too, is this 8-inch multimedia touchscreen. It's a full inch larger than the one that came before it in the previous Picanto. But not only here in the GT line, but even in the base S, it has wireless Apple CarPlay. I mean, this was a feature that we're impressed came standard on a $50,000 Audi Q3. The software's pretty good too, although the test cars we had both threw a few little connection issues with the wireless, but it's not too much of a thing to be worried about. And finally for this update, Kia has upgraded the digital screen in the dash to full colour, and it has some extra readouts too. One of the biggest draws of the Picanto for city buyers is its well under 4-metre length. This means the world is your oyster when it comes to spots marked small car only. But does it mean compromise on the inside? You might be surprised about how big the Picanto feels when you're inside. Now, annoyingly, there's no telescopic steering adjust, but the tall roof is a really good trick for making you feel like you're in a much bigger car than you actually are. And as I said in the GT line, there is some quite welcome padding for your elbows. There's big storage areas in the doors, and the center console has a damn cool trick, so you can use it either as a cup holder or a storage tray. Neat. Now, you might have noticed that this car is really easy to get in and out of, but that's because it's got these giant doors to go with its tall roofline. You can see here in the back seat, I've got plenty of room. There's plenty of room for my knees, plenty of room for my head, and the seat comfort is just about as good as it is in the front too, which is really impressive for something with this floor plan. What you don't get is directional air vents of any kind or power outlets, so it might be a little bit sweaty in the Australian summer. There's no cup holders in the back either. How about the boot? Well, let's take a look. Now, even on the numbers, the boot seems quite small, but depending on what you're using it for, it can be quite useful. For example, it still fits our largest CarsGuide travel case and shuts, so you don't have to rule out the airport run. What powers the Picanto? A tiny engine. Power outputs are nothing impressive, but it is a light car, so it has enough pep to get it around. In the case of the S and the GT line, it's a non-turbo unit, but those looking for something a bit more can opt for the punchier 3-cylinder turbo in the manual-only GT. Speaking of transmissions, there is the choice of either a 5-speed manual or old-school sounding 4-speed torque converter auto for the S and GT line. Let's take a look at what the Picanto is like behind the wheel. Well, it's better than you might expect, even though it's got this tiny little engine, it actually gets by. Like, there's not much power, but it's very light, so it's quite peppy. The downside is that 4-speed transmission in this auto model here. It's very transparent about what it's doing. It tends to give the engine that kind of revvy feel as you're accelerating, and you can tell that it is using quite a lot of fuel. The steering is surprisingly great. It's really direct, and you have a really nice feel of the front two wheels. My colleague Matt Campbell likes to say that a lot of Kias have a bit of a wooden feel in the steering, and that is a little bit present here. The feedback can be a little bit abrupt through it, but other than that, it's nice to drive. Okay, so the steering's pretty good, the handling's pretty good, and the engine is better than you might expect. But what about the ride? Well, here in the GT line, it is surprisingly firm. It's quite abrupt over bumps, and it can be especially hard over the rear where it's got that torsion bar suspension. Now, despite the Picanto being small and light, the fuel numbers we pulled from both our test cars were actually quite disappointing. Especially this 4-speed auto, you can get similar fuel consumption figures from hatches in the segment above with much bigger engines. The manual wasn't as bad, but then it's not the best transmission either. On the safety front, the Picanto now gets auto emergency braking as standard, which is pretty good across the range for something this cheap. Unlike international versions that are sold in Korea, for example, there's no blind spot monitoring or rear cross traffic alert, and this car also can't have adaptive cruise control either. Which brings me to another point about driving it on the freeway. As you might imagine, driving this car into city isn't the best. It's very revvy, it is quite noisy above 80 kilometers an hour, and the lack of that adaptive cruise control isn't great either. One of the big draws that Kia has over a lot of other brands is its famed 7-year unlimited kilometer warranty. It's rivaled in this segment only by the MG3, but you could argue that Kia has a bit more of an established history in Australia by now. The Kia Picanto is a clever little car in a segment that's often overlooked by Australian consumers. It is probably all the car you need in one of Australia's capital cities, but I can understand its lack of intercity flexibility, ruling it out from the kind of car that most people want. We like the angry looks of this GT line, but we think the best value pick in the range is probably the S Auto, which has most of the kit at a more compelling price.